Hey, this is Eric Sietzema, Patching Cracks on Twitter, doing a short little video to talk about whether or not Christians stole the December 25th date from the competing pagan faiths at the time of the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. And it's one of those weird little accusations. It started in sort of the 19th century. It's circulated for a number of years and has gained popularity at different times. And it wasn't actually until recently that I researched it, but I haven't seen a whole lot of argument in response to it, and that's weird because it's not a very good argument. And when you really sort of scratch the surface, it falls apart pretty quick. And so this video is this article and this video are the second that I've put out here recently about Christmas and the dating of Christmas. And just let me know what you think. Share it if you think it's worthwhile. And so we're going to kind of dive into this. The December 25th date, of course, there are two major Roman holidays in the ancient time that landed right at the end of December. One is Saturnalia. The other would be Natalis Sol Invictus. We're not going to really talk about Saturnalia, though I've heard it argued that Saturnalia was one of the holidays that Christians would steal from. It actually doesn't make that much sense because Saturnalia ran from the 17th through the 23rd of December, which means that it was over by the time the feasts associated with the birth of Christ took place. And so, it's not really reasonable that Christians would have stolen that date. I mean, why, right? And I think mainly when people would argue that, it's kind of something that comes out of a bit of cultural ignorance or like an ignorance of history. The other one is Natalis Sol Invictus. And in the 19th century, it was very popular to attribute a lot of this faith to Christianity. There was a lot of this done in the name of Emperor Constantine, and there was a book that came out a few years ago, Defending Constantine, that sort of corrected a lot of this really awful history. I highly recommend it. It's really worth reading. But in reality, there's not a whole lot of crossover, and Constantine really probably has less to do with this conversation than most people want to present it. But let's dig into this topic. So Natalis Sol Invictus did land on December 25th in the ancient Roman calendar. The holiday is the birth of the invincible sun. It's in reference to the sun god, Sol Invictus. And the idea was that it was supposed to land on the winter solstice. And as the days began to get longer, the idea was that Sol Invictus was declaring victory over the darkness. And so then they would celebrate his birth and his defeat over the darkness. And that was the idea. And actually, modern scholars have argued that the Romans would carry around candles to aid him in his fight against the darkness. And in reality, there's no ancient sources that present that as a thing that took place. That was a practice that was associated with Saturnalia, and they sort of folded that into Sol Invictus, and it really isn't something that's associated with Sol Invictus. There's not a great deal of support for it. It's a bit of irony considering the same guys who are arguing that Christianity stole from Sol Invictus are trying to glue bits of Saturnalia into Sol Invictus, but I digress. Anyway, so Sol Invictus is not a long time holiday by the time Christianity comes along. By the time the Council of Nicaea just sets the church calendar, and I believe the first copy, the oldest copy of the church calendar we have, is from around 350 AD, whereas the establishment of Sol Invictus as the official religion of the emperor was done by Emperor Aurelian, and that was in 274 AD. And the reason he did that was he looks around at Rome and it is a hot mess. There is very little unity. There's an awful lot of infighting. The empire is kind of coming apart at the seams. They'd had a series of like turkeys who were running the show, and they'd done a really poor job of managing things, and a lot of infighting over the throne and everything else. And so things are in bad shape. And in an effort to create unity amongst the people, Aurelian says, well, I'm going to introduce a pagan religion, like this, a new religion that will unite people. And it came with a great deal of pomp and circumstances, like 30 public games and new temples in his honor. And like it became the official religion of the empires and everything else. Like it was this huge thing that took place, trying to get people to buy into all of the spectacle. And it was a thing that was practiced every year. Later scholars sort of build this up a little bit, the acceptance of it. There's a little more going on here than anything than is obvious, though. Part of the reason that Aurelian did this is because paganism by this point was what some scholars refer to as a spent force. Paganism was on the decline in the Roman Empire, actually, like all over the Western world. Will Durant, in his book Caesar and Christ, talks about this at length. He said that their temples and their holidays and everything else are all sort of built into every aspect of life, and despite the fact that it's everywhere and a part of every aspect of life, the ancient faith was like diseased from the bottom all the way up to the top. Like the fact that they were deifying emperors, he said, revealed not how much the upper classes thought of their rulers, but how little they thought of their gods. Amongst the educated men, philosophy was whittling away at belief even while patronizing it. Greek and Roman poets mocked the gods in their writing. Common men didn't fear them. This means that, it didn't mean that people didn't do anything related to the temples. Actually, they would go see the fortune tellers. They would visit the temples and offer sacrifices. But it wasn't about the gods as much as it was superstition. Paganism was dying. It was collapsing. There was very, very little devotion to the gods. And what Aurelian was trying to do was he was trying to revive paganism, because he knew that sort of that religious life was necessary for the empire to be healthy. And so he brings about Sol Invictus, and holidays like Natalis Sol Invictus in an effort to get people excited about their religious paganism stuff again. And that is the world in which this religious thing is happening. And again, remember, the date here, 274, that is not that far off, about 50 years before Constantine issues the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan did not make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Actually, it made Christianity legal. It made it so that Christians didn't have to hide in the darkness anymore. It did make Christianity the official court religion, because Constantine was a Christian. He claimed to be a Christian. His mother was a Christian, and was a very devout Christian. There's no way around that one. And there was some argument about this in the 19th century. Again, I suggest you check out Defending Constantine. If you disagree with this, it's generally, there are people who will argue about it, but ultimately at the end of the day, the guy believed in Jesus, by the time he had died. He was not really on the fence by the end. So moving forward, having understood this background, we start asking some basic questions about whether or not Christianity stole this date to steal the thunder from the Sol Invictus faith, which had all of this pomp and circumstance. Well, the answer is, first off, that doesn't really make that much sense that they would. actually Christianity was growing. Um, During the late 3rd century and early 4th century, actually, there were emperors and upstarts who were sort of like forced into this position where they would have to let Christians serve in their armies, because if they didn't have enough soldiers. And so even though it was illegal to be Christian and to convert and to evangelize, they were letting Christians fight on their behalf because there were so stinking many of them. One of the things that Aurelian was certainly looking around at, and seeing his pagan-like temples abandoned and not being well taken care of, but he's seeing things like the Christian cult that they've been trying to stamp out forever, like growing and growing constantly and growing so much that they're forced to allow Christians to be in their army. And that's a little humiliating. It doesn't really make sense that Christians would then turn around and say, oh, hey, let's try to steal the thunder from this religion that they're using to try and prop up a religious system that isn't working. Now, let's take it a step further. If you look at the culture of the early church, these guys were being arrested, and they were being tortured, and they were having their property confiscated, and they were not living easy lives in the name of being Christians. It was illegal to be Christian. Many Christians, they were overtly avoiding being a part of anything pagan, so much so, even the appearance of anything associated with paganism, so much so that it was very common to accuse Christians of being atheists. Why? Because they wouldn't do anything associated with the gods. And so they said, well, they must not believe in any gods. Well, in reality, they did. They just only believed in one God. And so that atheism accusation, it makes sense for the pagans, because they're saying, well, you don't believe in any of our gods, you must not believe in any gods. Well, the Christians would avoid any gods. Well, they would rather be persecuted and labeled weird and excluded than even give the appearance of saying your gods are okay. They avoided the public games. They avoided public feasts. They avoided all kinds of stuff in the name of not looking pagan. Now, with all of that stuff, does it really make sense that they would say, let's steal Sol Invictus's religious stuff to make ourselves more popular? There was actually a movement in the 2nd and 3rd century called Gnosticism. Gnosticism was an attempt to take Roman mystery religions and combine them with Christianity in an effort to make Christianity more palatable to a wider segment of the Roman public. And those folks were essentially drummed out of the church. And there was huge amounts of ink spilled by the early church fathers debunking the writings of these Gnostic Christians. This is not the work of guys who would say, oh yeah, let's adopt a pagan faith and fold it in so that we can be accepted. It doesn't really fit the character of the early church. But for an emperor who's looking and saying, you know what, we're really struggling with this Christian cult thing, and they were struggling. They tried to stamp it out over and over again. It is a thing that he would do where he might say, let's put our holiday on top of theirs, and let's make a big deal out of it and take attention away from their feast days. And let's put Sol Invictus on top of their celebration of the birth of Christ. Oh my gosh, how can you say that? There's no proof of that. Actually, it fits the facts a little better than all that. For starters, the main reason folks argue that Christians didn't celebrate the birth of Christ before the Council of Nicaea, and actually there's a particular calendar that turns up. It's the Deposito Martyrium. I cannot even pronounce it correctly. It shows up around 350 AD, and it is a calendar, a church ecclesiastical calendar with all of these different events on it, and it includes all of the different ecclesial stuff, and it also tells us that Natalis Sola Invictus lands on December 25th. It is the first time we see Christmas listed on December 25th. It's also the first time we see Natalis Sola Invictus listed on the 25th. It's the first time both are listed there. There are no previous records of Christmas or Natalis Sola Invictus landing on that date. Now, scholars in the 19th century, or in the 19th century, use that to argue, well, Christians didn't celebrate Christmas on the 25th before this date because there's no record before this point. But they didn't apply the same standard to Natalis Sola Invictus. However, there is a case to be made that Christians would have acknowledged the December date before then. Now, before I get into that, there's one other thing. The Deposito Martyrium, or however you pronounce it, records one other thing, and it has to do with the Julian calendar. The Julian calendar was established by Julius Caesar. It is slightly inaccurate. The day length is just off, and it results in some floating dates, some drifting dates. That's why, actually, Christmas for the Western world is on December 25th. And then if you look at like the Orthodox Church, it's in January, like 14 days later or something like that, because it drifts down the calendar because they still follow the Julian calendar and it allows it to drift. That drift affected the date or the position on the calendar of the winter solstice. The winter solstice is recognized on that like early Christian calendar as landing on the 23rd, not on the 25th, which means that the Natalis Sola Invictus, which had to land on the winter solstice, was landing on the 23rd, not on the day that it was supposed to be associated with Natalis Sola Invictus. And in fact, that actually does bring up the fact that there are no ancient sources that record Natalis Sola Invictus as having to be on the winter solstice. That's a modern scholarly conjuration. Because there's no real evidence for it. Because it was something that was come up with as an explanation as to why Christians must have stolen their holiday. In reality, it makes more sense that instead of Natalis Sola Invictus being put on the solstice, they put it on Christmas. They put it on the birth of Christ to try and drown out the noise of those Christians that they were trying to get rid of. Well, why would they do that? What a stupid thing to do. Nobody ever would do something like that, except Roman emperors did that kind of stuff. And there are other examples of it. I would point to Emperor Hadrian, who in like 130 something AD, I don't remember the date, when he, in an effort to stamp out Christianity, went through the Holy Lands and went to sites where Christians were worshiping and built pagan temples over the sites where Christians were worshiping in an effort to make it so that they couldn't worship there anymore. And like on a crazy sort of thing, what ends up happening is a couple hundred years later, Constantine's mother, when Christianity is made legal, she was a Christian. She traveled to the Holy Land and starts looking around for all the places that different things happen. And she's talking to locals, and she goes to Bethlehem and she says, "Where was Jesus born?" And they're like, "Oh, that's easy. We used to worship there, but Hadrian built a temple over it. And it's still there, but there's a pagan temple over it." And so she replaced it with a Christian church. The same thing happened with the tomb and spot for the crucifixion. There's a church built there now. It's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And so like Hadrian accidentally preserved all of these Christian sites where major events for the life of Jesus took place because he built pagan temples over them. It's not that different from saying we're going to put our holiday over your celebration of the birth of Christ. Now, regarding any evidence whatsoever of Christians acknowledging the December date at all before the Natalis Sola Invictus thing was established. Well, there's a guy, Sextus Julian Africanus, who is a scholar. Actually, he was a scholar who debated with like huge names in the ancient world, like Origen. And Sextus Julian Africanus, there are portions of his work that have survived like in the whole, and there are parts that have survived in bits and pieces. He's considered to be one of the early church fathers. He debated with Origen on a number of issues and won, actually. Africanus recorded the month for the angelic announcement of the Immaculate Conception, and he places it 9 months before December. That would have been 50 years before Sol Invictus was established as the religion of Rome. That means that it is entirely possible that the early church observed the announcement by Gabriel and the birth of Christ well before Sol Invictus was established as the religion of Rome, and December 25th was picked as the Natalis Sol Invictus date, which actually fits my theory. There are other arguments that support this regarding when the Joseph and family would have gone to Egypt and everything else. I'm not going to get into them in this video, which has gone way too long already. Did not plan on talking about this for 20 minutes. But what do you think? Did Christianity try to steal from Sol Invictus, a religion that was introduced as sort of a spiritual, cultural CPR to a dying religious worldview? Or was that CPR, that attempt to save paganism, glued to the top of the growing cult movement to try and steal its thunder? Does it make sense that Christians who were tortured and executed, refusing to participate in basic pagan ceremonies, would then steal a pagan ceremony to try and hype their god? What do you think? I'd love to hear. If you think this is an interesting article and video, share it. Let me know. My name's Eric. God bless. Again, Patching Cracks on Twitter, and God bless.